candid conversations, unfiltered opinions, and humor with Evad Beck's podcast.
Hello, welcome everybody. Today we have Mr. Patrick Eilers. And Patrick is a licensed professional coach and also a licensed professional counselor. We are going to talk about things that do affect people and his career and what he does to help. So I'll defer to Patrick. Hi, Patrick. Welcome.
Hi. Thank you so much for having me today. Really looking forward to our conversation, and I think it's going to be exciting. Looking forward to it.
Yes. It's going to be exciting. And it's going to be deep stuff too. So Fair warning. So, Patrick, let's talk about, what you do in your career of being a licensed professional counselor. Is there a particular area that you focus on, or you would say your expertise is really, what's the word I'm looking for, like really focused? Because when we talk about licensed professional counselors, there's an array of area of coverage depending on, what the need is.
Definitely. Yep. Lots of different areas in professional counseling and coaching both. There's a lot of specific areas people sort of like to specialize in. I have been a specialist in the past. I've worked for a practice that specialized the last 4 years. We specialize in sex addiction. So we worked for a recovery program that basically helped people overcome sex addiction and heal from that. So there certainly was an element of my career that I have been specialized. Before that, I was more of a general practitioner, kind of like you're saying. Sort of more, I just kind of saw a lot of different ages, a lot of different groups of people, couples, individuals, kind of worked with everybody. So I've had different parts of my career where I've worked, sort of across the field in different ways. And then at the end of last year, coming into this year, I started my own coaching company. And so the goal with that is to really help people find balance. I mean, one of the things that we kind of have in our society today is a lack of balance. And so the coaching idea really comes out of two places. The first is to really help people identify in their life 8 dimensions of wellness. So that kind of that encompasses lots of different parts of their life: financial, environmental, spiritual, physical, emotional, intellectual, a lot of different areas that pie, so to speak, has of different areas in their life. So it's about finding balance in that pie. And then the secondary part with that is also working on helping people identify who they are, learn about themselves, learn about their emotions, so have greater emotional intelligence, and then being able to communicate that. I think when I'm talking about, in my experience, I've seen a lot of different symptomologies, whether it be anxiety, depression, whatever it is. You usually see a person has other things going on in their life kind of behind the scenes. Those are the symptomologies that show up. That's what sort of people see exteriorly, but internally there's some other things going on there. In my experience, those 3 areas, identity, emotional experience or emotional intelligence, and communication, really have a lot to do with helping a person become the really kind of cliche best person, best version of themselves, so to speak. So the idea is to try to help people focus on those areas, and hopefully that diminishes some of those other symptomologies that they have. Now, there certainly is people that are in need of deeper work, absolutely. And so there's certainly some that we want to encourage people to continue to explore that more if they need to. But my hope is that the coaching company really kind of blends or sort of bridges the gap between the average person population and sort of the deep therapeutic work. There really isn't a lot of places for that. And when you're as a therapist, we see a lot of people who work in that sort of space. And with insurance and a lot of other circumstances that are going on, it's kind of hard to necessarily help those people the same way you would somebody who maybe has all the symptomology, so to speak, of somebody who's diagnosable. So that's kind of the goal of the coaching company and kind of the shift I made. I felt like it fit more with my skill set.
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing that. So you mentioned something about balance, and I want us to expand on that a bit. And you said it's something that a lot of people in society who do not have that balance. And we hear this a lot, especially in the corporate world, work-life balance, which is usually not the case. It just means that you can take your laptop home and continue working. I believe that most people don't know that there's a balance that could exist that can actually lead to harmony, personal harmony. Do you see that to be true? And also that people don't know where to turn when it comes to really honing in and finding a place to balance their lives, to eliminate those symptomologies you mentioned?
Yeah, I would kind of go a little bit more on the lines that I think people believe that exists, but I think people have a hard time not allowing their basket or their pie, so to speak, whatever analogy you want to use, to get filled up. So I think it's a harder space to know, like, this is me doing a lot of things well, me doing kind of a lot of things in kind of use of personal harmony. And then there's a part of where I get overwhelmed. And I think it's pretty easy for us right now in this society to get overwhelmed, mainly because the way I look at it is that we have a lot of intimacy with devices. Like you just talked about, the laptop can come home.
Right.
It never, it doesn't get left at work. You have a real hard time breaking and separating from that particular space. I see this a lot with the phone when I was working within the addiction world. People have a super, super intimacy with their phone. Their phone goes to the bathroom, phone goes to the bedroom, phone goes to places that the phone really has no real business to go to those things, right? That's lack of boundaries. So there's a part of that where I think a lot of those intimacies of the devices and those kind of things create a lot of this inability to have that balance I was just talking about. Now, balance doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to always be perfect all the time. It's hard to recalibrate that. There's certainly seasons in our life that create, mismatches in that, where it's not going to be stable all the time. But I certainly believe that one of the things that people sort of struggle with, and I also say this in my own personal life, is that it's hard to necessarily fill up all of those things in a way they complement one another, which is hard to do because sometimes there's things that just don't complement, right? There's certain things at work that happen that we have to take extra time to, or maybe if we have kids or other relationships in our lives that we have to, attune to. So it's kind of that, learning how to recalibrate that on a regular basis and knowing more about yourself, which goes back to some of that emotional intelligence I was talking about, knowing where you're at before things get overwhelming. Because a lot of times I meet people after that's already happened, right? That's usually when people are seeking help. So I think it's a lot about trying to find that balance in a sense that's a continual process. It's never something that just stops.
Yeah. So talking about phones, because that is really a problem, right? Especially with an addiction, with sex addiction, we'll come to that. But when it comes to our dependence on our phones, some of us wear watches, but we'll reach for our phones to check the time, right? Instead of the watch.
Yep.
Some of us have alarms set on our phones as opposed to a traditional alarm clock, right? Some of us have businesses or have careers that we have to respond to things in a time-sensitive manner or keep tabs on, what is happening, what we're doing career-wise. Where should we break that so it doesn't become, it's kind of silly to say it becomes a chronic problem because it already is a chronic problem.
Right. Yeah.
Where do we start enacting those boundaries where I'm a business person, I'm expecting a call from a client, or I'm checking to see if the client responded to me because they're waiting for an answer? Where do I break that where it doesn't impede on that balance that we're talking about? It doesn't go with me to the bathroom, to the bedroom, to the dining table, and during family time.
Yeah. Well, now that I started my own business, it's harder for me to say. It was better before when I didn't have it because I can relate to that differently now. But certainly the idea that yes, there is a part where these are tools that have become sort of, like I said, intimate in that way. I think when it comes to like the bathroom and the bedroom, one of the biggest things I always suggested with people when they used to work with the addiction was to create a garage for the phone and the devices, right? You have a basket or you have some place that the phone goes that's in like a public area, right? Or all the devices for that matter, could be tablets, could be other laptops, whatever it might be, have a place where all the devices go, at night. Keep them out of the bedroom, keep them out of the bathroom, really, make those boundaries concrete. Because if you don't, then those things are going to be able to be something that slips pretty easily. People put them in their phone, their pocket, and they bring them in, wherever they go. And so that's part of it. So I think there's some hard boundaries around those kind of places there. When you're talking about time, I think with people, I mean, we talk a lot about face-to-face time. And so part of it is, are you going to dedicate a certain amount of time within your family, whether it be you and a spouse, you and a girlfriend, you and a boyfriend, or if it's going to be, a family beyond that, kids and et cetera, dedicating a specific amount of time, this is the hour, 6 o'clock hour, 7 o'clock hour, whatever it is, to actually devote that time face-to-face, no matter what the case is. And everybody has the same rule. I think if you let only certain people participate in it or whatever the case is, then you're going to kind of find yourself back in the same spot, right? We like to do the same kind of thing over and over again. It's very easy for us to get comfortable with what has been sort of, we didn't have to think about or do a lot of intention before. So certainly that aspect that the more we think about, more we kind of, are aware of that time, I think the better. There's certainly some devices. I know there's an app that minimizes some of the colors and minimizes some of the things on the phone, which makes it a little less drawing for people to be focused on it. I think those could be helpful too, but I think it just depends on the person. I mean, there's certain people I think that are strong, have a stronger relationship with the phone than others. And also the other thing I'd say with that too is that are we able to do other things in our life that we find purpose with, whether it be physical activity, whether it be things that we do creatively, whether it be things that we enjoy. Now, there's a lot of creativity on the devices, which creates another part of that same issue, but those kind of things. And I think that there's some tactile things with that in that range. So, certainly getting involved in something like, either photography or painting, those kind of things, those are creative arts that you don't necessarily need the device for. Physical activity at the gym, going for walks, enjoying nature, like all those kind of things are all about being more present. So I think the phone unfortunately breaks us from being more present. So part of that thing is with the boundary as well is, how are we noticing how present we are with the people around us? Do we really know what's going on in their life? Do they know what's going on in our life? Are we being open to those kind of things? So there's a lot there, but I think that those are some kind of practical, like you could start today steps in that way.
Yeah, start small and it builds over time. You talked about emotional intelligence and the other three aspects. So for a person just stumbling on this terminology and hearing you kind of like categorize the three things that are needed for a semblance of harmony, where should a person start? Because it can be overwhelming, when you're like,
Yep.
things are not going right, you want to change, but you don't know what it is that you need to change. You don't know what it is that you need to improve or where to turn.
Yeah. So I think with emotional intelligence, there's two big areas. And the one area that people typically struggle with is the reflection part. There's a book I can recommend called Emotional Intelligence 2.0. It's a really good book. I've been kind of going through it myself. It's been a good insight there for me. I'm sure it'll be insight for people listening. But I think one of the first practical areas you can start with is to get what they call an emotions wheel. And there's lots of those out there. You can Google image them. The one I like, the one I've used, one I recommend for people is one from the Calm app. There's one that's online that basically has a bunch of different colors and different labels for those emotions. Use that in conjunction with some type of journaling. I think journaling is underrated. I think for everybody, I think that's something that's helpful. I know for me, it's something I struggle with too. But I've always thought about the idea that you want to journal in a way that's productive for you. A lot of times we think about journaling as kind of like a free association, basically like we're just sitting down writing whatever we're feeling. And that's not always the most effective type way of journaling. There's other types of journaling you can do. You can formulate some questions, ask some questions that are specific reflection questions. In the era of AI, you could use AI questions, ask it to formulate some questions of your own reflective day. Maybe ask it, hey, I need 5 questions on how to reflect my day. And it'll give you some different ideas there, some prompts. You can utilize what they call emotion cards. And it has those are available on Amazon, where basically it's a card that has a specific emotion on it and it has some prompts that go with it. So I think journaling could be a really great start because it kind of starts to get you thinking about what your emotions really are, how to label them, and then reflecting on where they're at sort of currently. And then that can help you identify if there's any overused word triggers or if there's other types of things out there that help you just to know kind of what's causing some of those things that may be creating some of this disharmony you're referring to. Emotions are something that people typically are afraid of, men and women. Seems like that's very common for folks. And I always think about them more as like signals. They're basically kind of like antennas picking up things around with the world around us. They're not designed to scare us. They're designed to help us understand what's going on. And so if we are not aware of what those signals are, then we're going to miss out on a lot of things around us. So I think there's a big part of also understanding that emotions are not to be fear-based. They're there to help us to improve and to make wiser decisions, I think is probably the best way I can put that. But I think that's another big part of it is not being afraid of emotions, whatever I'm feeling or experiencing.
I think society has, or humankind, wherever that came from, has labeled emotion in a negative light, right? And we have attributed, certain aspects of emotions to not be acceptable. Big girls don't cry, men don't cry. Even anger, don't be angry. No, be angry. Let your anger be righteous. Get that fire out. Because when you keep it in, it causes other things, right?
Yep.
So I think just because certain things have been labeled a certain way, people are naturally cautious of feeling or expressing emotion. So thank you for that. So let's go into the world of sex addiction.
Okay.
This might sound strange to people that this is actually a thing, right?
Mhm.
What is the definition clinically and for the everyday person listening to us? What is the definition of sex addiction?
Well, that's tough because it's hard to say there's just one definition per se of it. So I'll give you kind of the clinical sort of space of it, right? Is that there's about 10 different sort of experiences people have, you want to call them experiences, that create basically unhealthy sexual behavior. And so what is unhealthy sexual behavior? That's a large conversation that can go probably a lot longer than our time. But unhealthy sexual behavior has a lot to do with how people use sex. So if you think about like food addiction, people use food to feel better. And that's very similar to how sex is in that way, right? If I masturbate, I feel more numb. Sometimes I feel more connected. I feel less stressed, those kind of things. That's just an example, but that's kind of how people might use it. It's different than a substance because a substance kind of alters your sort of reality. I would say that sex addiction is more about trying to escape reality. So then giving yourself sort of a space where, fantasy exists and trying to be in that space. And a lot of times, I think, especially with sex addiction, it seems like it's also it's something that people keep really under wraps for various reasons. One, because there's a lot of shame, but the secondary part, I think, is because people feel like it's accepted, and a lot of people know that it's accepted. It's just not brought up. And so there's a lot of times where it's used in a way that is very just, I don't know if it, like I said, unhealthy is probably the best way to word it, but certainly that you're using sex in the way that it's not designed to be. It's not designed for intimacy, or it's designed for intimacy. You're using it in a non-intimate way. And so that's, again, where I talked about intimacy with the phone. A lot of people who view pornography, for example, they have a very intimate relationship with their device because their device creates that, false reality, so to speak. So there's a lot there with that. I think that, and again, it's something that's a progression. For some people, there can be people who are, that's a daily practice. Sometimes it's a multiple times a day practice. And then there's some people, maybe it's once a month. But it's kind of like, there's some personal understanding there as well. Like, again, what's unhealthy for one person might be different for somebody else. And that's another part of that whole, sort of spectrum of behavior. But I always think about, if you're having sex with yourself or masturbating in that sense, just as the example, you're not going to have a lot of intimacy with people around you, including your partner, because it doesn't feel safe to do that. It only feels safe to really be with yourself. So you may be intimate 95% of the time, but that 5% is the part that's missing. That's the part that your partner doesn't see. So that's some things. I don't know if that helps define it a lot, but that's some ways I would think about how sex might be used in an addictive pattern.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely sheds light on it. So when sex addiction is present, so from what I'm hearing you explain it, and this is for everybody listening, is something that somebody does solo, independently, as opposed to somebody else. So could that be the case, or could it be pervasive in a way where they actually use it in inappropriate way with somebody else?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's not just solo to it. I mean, again, I'm kind of just going with kind of the more, I would use kind of general sense that people typically, especially with like pornography, that's more of a solo behavior. But it could be masturbation without pornography. I mean, that's not common, but it does happen. It could be a multiple affair person. It could be a person who has chronic affairs, with somebody else specifically, or it could be just kind of jumping from relationship to relationship. I certainly think that's part of it as well. It doesn't mean that you've had multiple relationships in a row. It doesn't mean that you're in a sex addict. Not necessarily. It means that, there could be also unhealthy relationships out there too. So it's not just, there's a lot of different factors to consider, but it could be multiple relationships. It could be, other unhealthy behaviors, certainly risky type behaviors, whether it's like, being involved with orgies and those kind of things. There's certainly those aspects of some of those kind of behaviors as well. So it is a spectrum of it. I don't necessarily, it isn't just solo, but I'm just, most commonly, I feel like, at least in this era, that's really where we see a lot of people sort of being in the camp, is that they tend to be in that space. And sometimes that elevates in the amount of time that they use. Sometimes it elevates in the behavior. So sometimes you'll see a person who starts out watching porn and they will eventually end up moving toward affairs or to multiple relationships or those kind of things. It doesn't mean that's going to happen for sure, but that is sometimes that's part of people's escalation. So it's kind of like it would be like the alcoholic needs more alcohol to feel the effect. The same thing can happen for a person's behavior. You need to have more porn, or you need to have more adventurous behaviors or whatever in order to be able to get that type of effect from it.
So definitely start somewhere, and there's usually a progression observed.
Usually a progression. What I've seen is typically it's time. And again, it's a mix of that. I could say, I don't know if I would say it's all the time it's time, but certainly like the person who starts out watching porn when they're real young, or they run across it when they're, an adolescent or even younger. Typically that's the person that, they go from watching, maybe 15 minutes a week to watching, 15 minutes a day to 15 minutes an hour, that kind of thing. It's like that progression. It doesn't mean it's going to be immediate, but it does take some time, but that's usually one of the progressions you see. Sometimes it turns into their behaviors. I mean, it's common. So their way would go is if the more you're thinking about, like, so for example, if you're in an unhealthy relationship or a relationship that you're not happy in or that you feel fulfilled in, the more you're going to fantasize about having an affair, the more you're watching porn. So the more you watch porn, that's just an example. But like if you think more about those kind of behaviors, the more likely you're probably going to do it, which means eventually that you probably will, cheat on that relationship if you spend a lot of time fantasizing about that. That's just an example, but.
Right. You mentioned time increments, right? The people that watch pornography these are excuses I've heard. The people that have watched pornography and they're like, well, it's not that bad. I only do it for entertainment. Mm-hmm. And some have a handle on it where it doesn't affect their personal relationships. Some do not, to the point that they consume it in all forms, whether it is listening to erotica, reading erotica, on their commute to work, commute back from work, even on their personal time at home, if, they're asleep before everybody else or awake before everybody else or whatever the case, they consume this on a constant basis and it affects their relationship. What is the difference between maybe those two groups of people where somebody has a handle on it where maybe they do it once a week just because I just want to watch this once a week, pleasure myself and, my relationship continues. I understand this is entertainment as opposed to somebody that does it chronically and the reality of physically having intimacy with your partner suffers.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So I think that the similarity there would be that's the person who could be the functioning alcoholic or the functioning drug addict kind of thing, right? So however you define it, like you can define it as entertainment, understandable. There's a lot of sexualized material in social media that's not intended to be sexual, but it is. I think that's another contributor to why we have an amplification of a lot of these behaviors. But I do think that, from like you said, that, there's this person who sort of is defined, okay, it's entertainment, it's not cheating, those kind of things. And okay, I can see that justification in their mind. But typically when you have something like that, like you said, the suffering ends up being in the relationship. So there's somewhere along the way that somehow that ends up getting affected. And so usually, typically what ends up happening is that the person turns more into themselves and is less intimate with their partner for whatever, to whatever degree that ends up looking like. I think one of the things that seems to have happened and just seems like that's observationally that there's a separation between what is sexual and what is in relationship. And really, those are the things that are supposed to go together. But it seems like there's a lot of separation there. And as time goes on, like I said, with social media as well, there's a lot of things that are sexualized to get attention without intending it. The topic itself is not sexual. So like the one I think about all the time, and I've talked about our podcast, is the hiking stuff, right? There's this beautiful mountain and then there's a girl in front of it wearing yoga pants. I mean, that's not it's not intended to be sexual, but it ends up becoming sexual. And so again, that's one of those kind of, just as an example of one of those things that like somebody can post that and that they're certainly free to do that, but it certainly sets up a lot of those same type of thoughts and feelings for people, especially if they're struggling with internal voices of, the temptations and the looking and justifying a lot of those behaviors. You see that continue. So usually one of the things people tell me a lot, or used to tell me a lot when I see them, is that they say, well, I just wish that would just go away. Well, we don't live in a period where that can happen. We have to face it because the only way you could do that is to just not be on any type of like completely go off the grid, really. That'd probably be the only way. And even then you still have to figure out some way to deal with your own internal fantasy. So it's hard because it is going to be around us, but it's just like anything. What do you think about? What do you think about with sex? What do you think about in your mind? That really is where it starts, and it kind of builds off of there. So even the fleeting thought of, hey, I could go do that, that can be all it sparks just to kind of move in that direction. So like you said, the continuous habit of listening to like erotica, for example, on your way home from work, your body knows when that's going to happen. When that's going to start that fantasy for you. So if it's, if it's up early in the morning and driving, if it's coming home, whatever that is, it might help you relax, but you're using it in an unhealthy way, that material that's out there for you. Now, again, you have to make that personal judgment. And I think in a lot of cases for the relationship will suffer if you're doing those things because you're still giving a portion of yourself to that fantasy when you're not in the presence of your partner. So I don't know if that answers some of that question, but that's very common for people to build those kind of daily practices like that are healthy in their life and not really think anything of it.
Right. It did answer the question. So you mentioned orgy as, we were talking. There is a lifestyle, okay, for married couples, either advancing age, middle age, younger, where they do engage with other couples, either swapping or being in a group of other people. And, notably, there's a state here in the United States that has loofah villages. And, the different colors of loofahs indicate like different rankings of what you've done or whatever, all of that. So
Okay.
you didn't know about this? You said, okay.
No, I didn't know about the loofahs. No, I know about the wife swapping. Yes, I've heard of that.
I just educated you, Patrick. So there are communities that do these behaviors or engage in these behaviors in a way that is acceptable, right? Mm-hmm. And there are podcasts and couples who actually engage in this lifestyle and do things of this nature.
Yep,
so we have, nudist colonies that sometimes get sexual, or we have resorts, these nature. So people engage in this because they feel like, okay, I can do this freely. I can be amongst people who are not judgmental, or, or people with similar mindset. What is the detriment of possibly engaging in this to a point that it becomes a problem? Like what is, can this be done innocently without having to be concerned of a chronic reoccurrence?
Yeah, I think, and you see, and there's been cultures, right, where, you can marry multiple people, and, that's certainly been something we've seen in the past and whatnot. And like you said, there's lots of different areas that people engage in those kind of behaviors. I mean, I think the two things I guess I would think of when it comes to that, I mean, the number one, and we just kind of talked a little bit about it, is the functioning. What is a person thriving in those particular environments? And they may say yes, and I guess it depends on how they define thriving. But I do think that there is certainly a part of us that if we believe in the relationship being something that's between two people exclusively, and when you talk about intimacy, again, that word gets skewed a lot. Intimacy doesn't necessarily mean always a physical intimacy. It means an emotional, intellectual, really the deepest way you can know a person. And that goes across the board. And that's not easy for anybody. There's no human being on the earth that's ever going to say, oh yeah, that was an easy thing to do. There's certain relationships where the intimacy is different than it is with like in the partnership of a marriage or like a covenant relationship, those kind of things. So I can understand some of those things where people might say, well, it's a little different, but I do think that functioning is probably the big piece. And then the secondary piece to that is really just, personal fulfillment. I mean, it is hard to have that personal relationship with somebody, but if you're not able to, have intimacy with one person, you're not going to be able to probably have intimacy with anybody else either, because it just isn't going to feel safe. So now these other types of behaviors may create a phony safety or a false safety. I would say that's probably one of the things I would think of. I don't know. I've never talked to anybody who's gone through something like that. So it's hard for me to fully understand what their perspective might be. Right. But I do think from a perspective of, like, if you're looking at it as personal fulfillment, personal understanding of being with one person, I think you're going to miss out on that fulfillment of that. And there's going to be kind of a false sense of safety there. So that would be a couple things I guess I would think of in those lifestyles. Does that mean it's unhealthy? I mean, there certainly could be some elements of it. One of the things with sex addiction that seems to be a pretty consistent thing is that, the person uses sex for their own personal betterment of whatever that is, right? To feel better through their stress, to feel better through something that's going on in their life, whatever it is, right? So they're using sex really in a selfish way when sex isn't meant to be a selfish behavior. And so that's where I guess when I go back to some of these other things, where does, I always think about almost always, sex addiction has some root of, self gratification or self indulgence. Whereas if it's in a relationship, typically it's about, connecting two people.
Right. So, talking about self-indulgence, self-gratification, it's really hard not to, in our world today, it's really hard not to acknowledge the explosion of toys, adult toys, that encourage this personal gratification, right? And, we have the red pill and I think is it blue pill, where men are no longer wanting to go on dates with women, and women are like, okay, men are just atrocious,
Mhm.
and we're not safe around them. So, what gives? I will invest in an array of toy on both sides and just call it a day.
Right.
What is the detriment of that when a person, yes, right now you may not want a relationship. However, in the future, you may actually find somebody that, you fall in love with. And
Yeah.
would these habits catch up, or is that something that can easily be broken?
Well, I do think that the habits will catch up. Absolutely. In a lot of cases, at least with the men I've worked with, I haven't really worked with any women. The practice I was at, we had women therapists who worked with women. So I would work with the men mostly, but most men don't seem to want to have they don't start out with a desire to watch porn. It's not like necessarily the goal. The goal is like, if you're younger specifically, usually it has a lot to do with, it makes you feel better in the moment because you've had rejection. Typically that's usually where it starts. Not all the time, but some of the time. And so anyway, as that continues to build through your life, I mean, you focus more on it being, something that's a coping mechanism. I feel sad, I feel lonely, I feel disconnected. This is going to make me feel better for a short period of time. So I can't totally speak to on either side with it when it comes to toys. I think the same kind of thing happens. I mean, again, you're cocooning yourself from, emotional intimacy.
Okay.
Intellectual intimacy, if you want to call it, you call both of those, right? The physical piece is not there either. You're just kind of you're engaging with yourself. And of course, you're safe because you're in control of it, right? So there's a control aspect there, which when you're talking about intimacy, in order to be really transparent with somebody else, you have to trust that the other person is going to not hurt you, and that's what people are trying to avoid.
Yeah.
And so I think from that perspective, that the level of intimacy, especially emotional intimacy and being connected with somebody, the more you practice your own self-gratification, the more you continue to practice that internal sort of, and I'm not saying it's easy for anybody. Of course, it's difficult for everyone, but the more you practice that, the more it's harder now to be able to be open to the person who you do love or do you care about. And that doesn't always necessarily mean that person's going to be really, again, it also creates less stimulation to the person that you're actually interested in too, because your touch, and your touch is better than their touch, right? No matter what. And that's where the whole like directing and understanding and those kind of, so now we're getting into a little bit different type of therapy.
It's all about communication, yeah. And some people feel, because I've had this conversation with, some women. Again, I'm in healthcare, I see aspects of this. And people do not have patience to teach or to communicate what feels good, what they want. Because again, women are concerned about being told they're aggressive, or, they're not allowing the man to do whatever. But if I can't tell you what I like, then what are we doing? Right? So it goes into people finishing off in the bathroom after an encounter, like a physical encounter, that is.
Yep.
So there has to be room for communication, because it is a give and take scenario, or benefit, however you want to phrase it. So I think it's the taking time to talk to somebody, because you know what feels good. But if you really value having this, it begs to, communicate what you would like. So you explained that very well. Thank you. And let's delve into the effect of sex addiction when it comes to pornography in a marriage, right? So what can a partner do, wife or husband, if they find that over the years, their partner has increasingly gotten worse, their intimacy or sex life is non-existent, because the one partner has chosen pornography over intimacy or sex, and they do everything to create that space, so that they can self-gratify. What can a person do? One, if a person recognizes if a partner does understand or realizes that, yes, I do have a problem, but it seems that they're not willing to change. And on the other side, yes, recognizes that there's a problem and they're willing to change. How can that journey begin? And what should they expect on that journey?
Yeah. So multiple questions there. So I'll see if I can try to answer all of them. But okay. So when you start out, a lot of times what we saw a lot was that partners typically, and again, this is partner to partner. This is not, I'm not making any blanket statements here, but some partners don't have as much concern about pornography. I've had some partners where they're just like, you know what, I don't want that. I obviously don't want that in my marriage, but I'm going to try to, I'm going to work with my partner, whoever the person is acting out with, the male or the female. Then there's our partners who've actually said it's worse having a partner engaged in pornography because it's like they're having an affair with 2,000 women instead of one. So it really depends on partner perspective. I also think it depends on probably people's individual backgrounds. Partners who've been abused or have been gone through a lot in their own life, betrayal, are probably going to be much more sensitive to it than a person who maybe hasn't gone through that. That's, again, not a blanket statement. That's just sort of observational. It depends on the person. I think if we're talking from male's the one that's acting out perspective, usually most of the time, a lot of the men, just like we talked about earlier, don't see it as being an issue, right? They've recognized it as it's affected them, but they're not really sure how it's affected them, or if it has. They usually blame it on the partner. So again, there's a lot of denial there. I've had guys where they've been like very open about, hey, look, this is an issue and I got to work on it and I got to get rid of it. But for the most part, usually people have a lot of denial around it, because typically it could be kind of a doorway to other types of behavior. Certainly how they view women, their conversations with their social circles, those kind of things, those play a huge role in that as well. If you're hanging out with a bunch of guys who are watching porn and they're talking about porn, they're sharing porn with one another, your chances of escaping it are pretty low just because of the fact that you're around it a lot, right? If you're the solo person who sees it every once in a while, you probably have a little bit different scenario there. One of the things I think that's really important for both male and female to understand the relationship is that this behavior has affected the relationship. So you can't escape that part of it. What I saw a lot of the time is that the partner would send the guy who has been the betrayer to us, and they would say, well, you work with Patrick and work on your stuff, and you obviously got some sexual issues to work out or whatever, and I'm going to be over here waiting for you to finish that process. And almost all the time, again, I don't want to usually make blanket statements, but for the most part, 97, 8, 9% of the time, the partner has what they call some type of partner betrayal trauma. What that means is that the partner has been betrayed in the relationship, and so now they have similar to PTSD symptomology where their body and their mind reacts very similar to that, right? They're going to look for things that are happening that may not be there. They're going to be hypervigilant about where their partner goes, what they do, where they're at, what they're looking at, what they're seeing, and they're looking at somebody else that they didn't look at. Like, those kind of things are very, very common. And so what ends up happening is it's really important for a partner to also recognize, okay, I've been affected by this behavior because it's been a betrayal. I now need to work on myself to recognize where I'm going to be triggered. And now if we want this marriage to work together, which you both have to commit to doing, we have to now work on this. My analogy, I use a fish tank. It's a fish tank with red food coloring in it, right? Mm-hmm. The water's still there. Everything in it's still living, but the water's been tainted. Now we have to work on this together. This is not just a solo issue. If you don't do that, what ends up typically happening is it's a lot of this sort of, she's going to try to control the situation to not be hurt. He's going to have a very hard time being able to prove himself because, again, the changes that are usually made are very small and incremental, like we talked about earlier. And it ends up having that the relationship just becomes a power control, right? It just becomes either she's going to control him so that he can't act out, or he's going to try to, pull away, and there's going to be still no intimacy. So it has to be a relational thing. And that's really, really hard for both partners to hear, but specifically to hear for the partner who's been betrayed, to hear that it's two steps, because she feels like she doesn't have any, it doesn't matter who it's been, but either side's always like, hey, I didn't do this. I didn't betray. I didn't cause this, right? Which I can understand. But at the same time, like, unfortunately, that's just the nature of the way the reactions are for people. And you see this in other areas. You certainly see this with relationships that weren't married, but the people who've been cheated on. You mentioned it earlier. Certainly this growing, I use the word chrysalis, of the idea that, men are terrible or women cheat or whatever those beliefs are that I start to, sort of put in my mind, those just grow. The more betrayal I have, the more those grow. The best combat you have against that is just continue to not let that be the truth, right? That was an individual experience. It wasn't necessarily something you caused to make the betrayal. Both partners had a role in that. It doesn't mean that you are the one that made that decision, right? But it does mean that you have to live with the consequences, unfortunately, and that's true for all of life, right? There's just consequences we all have to navigate of things that we didn't necessarily choose to do. You can go out and drive out in your intersection or outside your house and get hit by a car and never expect that that's going to happen. It may not be your fault, but it's a consequence of what somebody else chose to do. So I don't want to minimize that because I know I can understand people are very sensitive to that, and it makes a lot of sense. We live in a very sensitive society with that because there's just so many things that like that's a commonality for people to have happen for marriages and relationships alike. But I think it's important for us to be realistic about it because that's one of the things I ran into a lot when I was doing that work was that people were not very realistic about it. They wanted it to be, they wanted, the common things we work with couples is you hear, I want it to go back to what it used to be. Well, unfortunately, it's not going to go back to what it used to be. It's going to have to be recreated. So you think about, during World War II, there was a lot of different, ships and planes and all kinds of stuff that were made for the war effort, right? At the end of the war, they had all these surplus planes and boats and everything else laying around. Well, what they do with them? They cut them up for scrap, melt them down, and built them into something else. Yep. That's kind of that's kind of what's going to happen in the relationship. It's going to have to be melted down and made into something else. Doesn't mean it's going to be worse than what it was or it's going to be like it was before, but it may be better than what it was before. And I think that's a realism that people have to embrace. And that's not it's not easy. It's not fun. It's not necessarily something everyone wants to do, but that's sometimes what you have to do. It's the changing of that part. So I do think that relationally, it's a very sensitive issue, and that can be, and I want to be sensitive to that. But at the same time, it's something that it's hard for me also to sit here and go, the betrayer is the person has to pay for what they've done because it just isn't like that. So,
yeah, absolutely. I've also seen where the partner, usually the wife, is so exhausted with reoccurrence after promises to not engage in the behavior or discovering new things where they just disengage for safety, right? Disengage. Since you've chosen this, since over the years you haven't changed, great. How about you do you and I'll do me? How's that? And that can either be utopia or a sinking ship. So people find ways to cope around it, I think. Nobody really wants to make their partners feel bad, by reacting or disengaging, but sometimes it's self-preserving. Self-preservation, I think, is better than murder. So,
well, and I guess to kind of go off that too, like men have to step up in that sense as well, or the person who was the betrayer, men or the woman, they have to step up in that sense. Like, as much as you might have a strong desire to do those things, as much as it helps you escape, whatever you want to call it, your partner's asking you to do something for the relationship. And so then the question becomes really not about stopping the behavior as much as it becomes, what do you really want in this relationship? Right. Because your relationship is going to be the one that's going to suffer. You internally may not suffer. You may be callous about it. You may not think anything of it. But the relationship will suffer one way or the other. Like you said, it becomes self-preservation. And so the person who's been the betrayed, they will suffer with those symptoms. And is that something you really want them to continue to suffer? Or do you want to become a better partner and work with them on doing that? And it becomes a partnership.
Yeah, a lot said and a lot to consider. So all in all, if you find yourself in a behavior that is detrimental to your relationship, it is wise to work on it, address it. The scrap metal analogy I absolutely love because, again, it's like, crumbling a sheet of paper and expecting it to be the same again after it's never going to be the same. You have to find other ways to make it work because that trust already has been bridged. So, Patrick, if somebody listening to us is struggling and truly does want to make a change, but they don't know resources around them and they would like to reach out to either work with you, your organization, how can they do that?
Absolutely. So the best way to get a hold of me is through our company email. Then that's bloomworkscc@gmx.com. Bloomworks is one word, CC. The name of the company is Bloomworks Concepts and Coaching. We do have a Google business page. You can check us out there. We have a link right to the therapy portal, which you can schedule a session within the week, and we'll have a 30-minute free consultation to meet with people on the coach side of it. That's the best way to get a hold of me. I do have a Patreon channel where I basically put together all of the podcasts I'm part of, any kind of resources, other therapists I know, other colleagues I know, those kind of things. I put all those resources on my Patreon channel. It's patreon.com/Bloomworks. That's kind of like my business page as far as those kind of things go. I'm on LinkedIn as well, Patrick Eilers, MALPC. So you find me up on there on LinkedIn. Good way to follow me there as well. That's And then also a personal Instagram. It's rated_PGE. Don't post a lot of stuff there about therapy stuff, but those are some different ways to get a hold of me.
Great. Thank you. And we're going to make all of that available in the show notes. So again, there's a free 30 minutes consultation. It's free. FREE, free.
Yep.
Right. So take advantage of it. So, Patrick, something that I usually ask of my guests as we wrap up a segment is, to leave a few golden nuggets for our listeners. So what would be the golden nuggets that you would like our listeners to walk away from, especially with this conversation? Sorry, Patrick. What would you like them to walk away with? Goodness, English is escaping me this morning.
What would you like to walk away with? Okay. I was going to say, because there's a couple different things I guess I could think of. And the first thing is that there's a great song by a group named Switchfoot, and one of their lines in one of their songs is every breath is a second chance. And I always think about that from the perspective that everyone who's working on, no matter what it is, if it's physical health, emotional health, intellectual, whatever it is you're working on right now, you have the ability to be able to move forward, and that your next step is your next breath, and you don't have to continue down the same path that you've been on. I hope that today's conversation opened the door to the idea that there's a lot of things that we're struggling with, we're all working on. You're not alone in those things, and that you'll have the courage to step into those spaces for your own personal growth to impact the rest of other people's lives. And in my belief that we're all dominoes in some ways, and if we knock down one person's next domino, then we also have the responsibility to next knock down the next domino. And knocking down a domino doesn't have to be a huge inspirational thing. Sometimes it's just the fact that we have somebody who can relate to us, understand that we're not alone in those things. So I think knocking down your next domino, what does that look like for you? What does that look like is that taking a step and making a consultation? Is that taking a step and reaching out to somebody? Is that spending time with your partner? Whatever that might be, you have the ability to do that and the strength to do that. So if I can leave that with the listeners, that would be something I would hope that they would see and get from this conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And that was a lot. Every breath is a second chance. Yes. So use it wisely. If you value yourself, you value your relationships, it is great to go and step into it. There's help. You're not alone. Okay. There's plenty support. You just have to decide to we can want it for you, right? We cannot want it for you. You have to want it for yourself. So thank you, Patrick Eilers, for being here. I appreciate you. And thank you, everybody, for listening. So if you're interested in reaching out to Patrick, we have everything in the show notes. You're going to click in and just get right through to him. 30 minutes free consultation is not bad. All right. Thank you, everybody. Take care of yourself. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thanks for tuning in to AVP podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave us a review. It really helps us out. We'd love to hear your thoughts and continue the discussion. So join us on social media or drop us a message. Until next time, keep exploring, stay curious, and keep pushing the boundaries of your world.